Many Magic the Gathering players ask the question, how do I build a mana base for my commander deck? A good mana base is the foundation of any functional deck, but knowing what precisely constitutes a good mana base in 2023 is no easy task. There's more to a good commander mana base than simply playing the right ratio of lands to spells. With so many dual lands and other useful non-basic lands to choose from in today's commander format, how is a Magic the Gathering player to know exactly which lands to choose and which lands to use for their commander deck? Several years ago, I released 5 guides to how to build mana bases for Commander, one for each of the different color combinations, from mono-colored decks to 2, 3, 4, and even 5-colored decks. But in the several years since I made those videos, a lot has changed about the Commander format and the game of Magic the Gathering as a whole. The degree to which Wizards of the Coast caters to the format has increased dramatically in that time, while even the power level of cards not printed specifically for Commander has skyrocketed thanks to sets like Modern Horizons. As such, it is time to update the models laid out in that original video series. This video will cover Tolarian Community College's definitive guide to Commander mana bases. I will discuss mana bases of all kinds, from monocolor to 5-color rainbow. I'll highlight the lands you should be including in your deck and what the ideal breakdown of those lands should be. And while the focus of this video will be on optimal builds, it will also highlight a few budget replacements for the most expensive lands. And of course, remember, while this is Tolarian Community College's definitive guide, the true author of a definitive guide is yourself, the choices that you make. I simply hope this video helps you in making those choices. Let's begin, shall we? But first, Stanley Tucci, Jason Momoa, Keanu Reeves, Sir Patrick Stewart. What do all of these gentlemen have in common? Whether they're blonde or brunette, bearded or clean-shaven, long-haired or bald, they're all gorgeous, just like you. That's right, whether you like dressing up or dressing down, a comfy tee or a necktie, long hair or none at all, you look amazing. And just like any other fashion statement, keeping your hair or letting it go should be up to you. But what do you do when your genes decide to ignore your preference? What can you do when the curls you've had since you were a kid start to disappear? That's where this video's sponsor, Keeps, comes in. Keeps services are FDA approved and are clinically proven to treat hair loss and to stimulate hair growth. Not only that, they offer an array of other products such as thickening shampoo, conditioner, and styling pomade to help you take good care of your hair. By the time they reach age 35, 2 out of 3 men will experience some form of hair loss. And if that isn't part of the look you want, Keeps can help. All Keeps treatment plans are recommended by a licensed medical provider, and according to clinical studies, their treatments are 90% effective at treating hair loss and can increase hair growth by as much as 35%. Keeps is safe, discreet, and delivered right to your door every 3, 6, or 12 months, whatever works best for you. Perhaps best of all, Keeps typically costs half of what typical pharmacies charge, so it won't upset your schedule or break the bank. So remember, hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get started, go to keeps.com/Tolarian or just click the link in this video's description. That's keeps.com/Tolarian. Thank you, Keeps, for sponsoring this video. Let's start with the basics. The first step in building your mana base is taking stock of the spells you want to cast with your mana. If your mana curve is low to the ground, you won't need as many mana sources. On the other hand, if you have a lot of higher mana value cards in your deck, you'll want to make sure you have plenty of lands so you can reliably cast these cards when you draw them. Many Commander players choose to cut back on their land count in order to fit more of their favorite spells in their deck. You are, of course, welcome to do this, but recognize that the decision does come with a cost. Spells are fun, yes, but the less reliably you can cast them, the fewer of them you'll get to actually play, and the less fun you'll therefore get to have in your game of Commander. Concerns about mana flood are valid, but remember that you always have access to your Commander, and that you'll need to pay extra mana to recast your Commander every time it gets removed. Therefore, you are much more likely to have too little mana than too much. This is doubly true if your deck has a pair pair of partner commanders, a commander that comes with a background, or a commander that comes with a mana sink. Different commander decks will have different mana base requirements depending on the deck's commander and archetype. Generally speaking, a deck with a lower curve can get away with playing 33 to 35 lands, while more mid-range decks with a higher curve should play no fewer than 38 lands. You are also more likely to want more lands the more colors you put in your deck. A monocolor commander deck with a medium curve will be able to get away with a 35 land deck much more readily than even a low curve 3-color one can. Most casual commander decks are mid-range decks and therefore should err on the side of playing more lands rather than fewer. If you are unsure how many lands to put in your deck, I would recommend starting with 38 and adding or subtracting lands over time once you get some practice with your deck. More colors equals higher standards. The lands you choose for your deck will depend on the number of colors in your deck. Monocolored decks will naturally consist of upwards of 25 to 30 basics, with the rest of the mana base made up of monocolor and colorless utility lands. Two-color decks should play around 10 to 20 basic lands, between 6 and 8 utility lands, and fill out the rest of the mana base with dual lands. Three-color decks should play no more than 10 basics and no more than 4 or 5 utility lands. 4 and 5 color decks should generally only play 1 or 2 basic lands of each of their colors and no more than 3 utility lands. The more colors your deck plays, the higher your standards should be for the dual lands that you put in that deck. This is because you're going to have access to more copies of the stronger dual lands, and thus don't have to dig as deep for playable dual lands. Pathways, for instance, are good dual lands for 2-color decks, but shouldn't make the cut in all but the most budget of 5-color mana bases. Unless you are on a budget, I recommend putting as few tapped lands in your mana base as you can manage. There are enough good lands that enter untapped these days that you shouldn't need to scrape the bottom of the barrel for your mana fixing. The card quality in Commander is also high enough that it is much harder to justify disrupting your curve with a tapped land. In most cases, you're better off playing a basic land than a tapped dual land. There are, however, a couple exceptions to this rule. The first is the triomes in decks with 3 or more colors. These lands are excellent sources of fixing, especially in tandem with fetch lands, and should absolutely make the cut in mana bases of 3 or more colors. The second exception to the no-tap land rule is the Ravnica bounce lands in 2-color decks. These lands effectively draw you a card, since the land they return to your hand can be used for a later turn's land drop. Drawing a card while fixing your mana is an acceptable exchange for the cost of your land entering tapped. Evaluating dual lands. The mana base for every multicolor commander deck begins with a copy of Command Tower, the single most ubiquitous mana fixer in Commander. From there, City of Brass, Mana Confluence, Reflecting Pool, and Exotic Orchard are untapped rainbow lands or near rainbow lands that you can technically play in any multicolored deck, but get more valuable the more colors in your deck. I would avoid these lands in 2-color decks, but consider them auto-includes in decks with 4 or 5 colors. If you can afford it, the original dual lands are the best option for duels in Commander. However, printer ink is getting to be very expensive, so I understand if you are not able to afford running these. Nonetheless, original duels are excellent because they are fetchable, they enter untapped unconditionally, and they don't cost you any life. That said, you should never feel the need to buy original duels in order to succeed in Commander. There are plenty of Commander legal lands that enter untapped most or all of the time, and paying a bit of life for your land is not a very big downside when you have 40 life to work with. Budget ally color decks are fortunate in that they can easily replace original duels with the Tango lands from Battle for Zendikar. These lands are just as fetchable as original duels and will usually enter untapped when you fetch for them in the mid to late game. Fetch lands are the other best mana fixers in Commander, as they act as additional copies of all your typed dual lands. The number of fetch lands you run in your deck will be dependent on the number of colors in your deck. Most monocolor decks should not play any fetch lands. Why? Because deck thinning with fetch lands in Commander is not a real plan, as pulling an extra land from your 99-card deck does not meaningfully change your odds of drawing a spell next turn. The only reason to play fetch lands in a monocolor deck is if you're playing a deck with landfall synergies, which benefit from fetch lands giving you a second landfall trigger. Ideally, 2-color decks should play 8 fetch lands: the on-color fetch land, Prismatic Vista, and the 6 half-color fetch lands. Half-color fetch lands are those that only fetch one of the 2 basic land types in your colors. 3-color decks should play all 3 on-color fetch lands at their disposal: Prismatic Vista, and as many additional half-color fetch lands as you have access to. 4 and 5-color decks should likely run all 10 fetch lands, in addition to Prismatic Vista. If you're short some fetch lands or you're on a budget, and you're also low on printer ink, there are a few other options available to you. Fabled Passage does a decent impression of Prismatic Vista, especially in decks with a higher curve. Ash Barrens and the 1-mana land cyclers from Lord of the Rings are also excellent sources of cheap mana fixing, as they can be slotted into your curve whenever is convenient. The Lord of the Rings cyclers are particularly good because they can find you a typed dual land or triome, making them excellent budget replacements for fetch lands. Myriad Landscape makes up for entering the battlefield tapped by ramping you an additional land when activated. Krosan Verge does the same, though it is limited to just Selesnya-based decks. I don't recommend running Evolving Wilds or the Panoramas unless you are on a significant budget, as the fixing they provide is not worth the downside of the land they fetch entering tapped. Shock lands are another excellent source of fixing in Commander, especially in 2 and 3-color decks. You will almost always be able to afford the 2-life cost to have them enter untapped when you need to, or you can play them tapped if you don't have a use for the mana, such as if you're fetching for 1 at the end of an opponent's turn. Every 2 or 3-color deck should include the shock land or lands within the deck's colors. 4 and 5-color decks can play as many shock lands as they'd like, but that number may be fewer than the 6 or 7 that they are legally allowed to play, especially if these decks are already maxing out on original dual lands. Most 4 and 5-color decks have 1 or more color pair that's least represented among the 6 or 10-color pairs that make up the deck. For instance, maybe white and blue are the least represented colors in your sliver deck, so you opt not to run a Hallowed Fountain. The next best dual lands in Commander are the Battle Bond lands. These lands are functionally equivalent to original dual lands for a fraction of the price, as they enter untapped unconditionally in Commander. The only difference is that these lands are not fetchable, which means you likely won't play all 10 of them in an optimized 5-color deck. Horizon lands are great dual lands in decks that have access to them, that is, Selesnya decks and enemy-colored decks. These lands provide you untapped mana fixing and can be cashed in for a fresh card late in the game if you find yourself flooding. Any 2-color deck that can play these lands should, and you should play as many as you can in your 3 and 4-color decks. 5-color decks likely won't have room for more than 1 to 3 copies of these lands. Lastly, the triomes, which I touched on earlier. These are the best dual lands at your disposal in 3-color decks, and provide great fixing in 4 and 5-color decks as well. In 4 and 5-color decks, though, you should be careful not to run too many triomes. Because of how useful it is to be able to fetch for a triome at your leisure, it's easy to forget that these lands are still tap lands, and thus drawing too many of them early is a real cost to playing a lot of them. I would be careful running more than 3 triomes, and would certainly not recommend going above 5 in a 5-color deck. Building for 2 and 3-color Commander decks. Whereas 4 and 5-color decks can stick to the premier color fixing in the format, 2 and 3-color decks will need to dig deeper into the Commander dual land pool in order to flesh out their mana bases. The next tier of dual lands are the Pain lands and the Slow lands. Pain lands are excellent in Commander, as they always enter untapped and you'll have plenty of life to spare. You can even just tap them for colorless mana a lot of the time, especially later in the game when your life total may be dwindling. Slow lands are also some of the best non-typed duels in Commander, as the odds of having to play them before turn 3 are fairly low in a 99-card deck. Below Pain and Slow lands come the Check lands, Pathways, and Filter lands. These lands enter untapped all or most of the time, and are therefore acceptable sources of untapped mana fixing. These lands are at their best in 2-color decks, but perform just fine in 3-color decks as well. No matter how many colors your deck is, I don't recommend putting fast lands or reveal lands into your deck, as these lands will not enter untapped frequently enough. It saddens me to say it, but I also don't recommend running creature lands or temples. There was a time when these were auto-includes in Commander mana bases, but there are just so many better options now. I also consider all the remaining dual lands that I haven't yet mentioned to be too weak for present-day Commander. Yes, even the dual land that I didn't mention that you're asking about in the comments right now. I didn't mention it because no, it's too weak for Commander present day. Yes, even that one. And that one. No mana base is complete without a few key utility lands. Utility lands are lands that provide you with some beneficial effect beyond just fixing your mana. Many of these lands are colorless, but in recent years, we've seen a significant boost in utility lands that provide a colored mana source. The most notable example of this are the channel lands from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty: Bosaiju, Who Endures, Atawara, Soaring City, Iganjo, Seat of the Empire, and Takanuma, Abandoned Mire. Yes, you're correct in noticing that I did not list Sokenzan, Crucible of Defiance. That is because it is not a land worth including in your red commander deck. Something else to consider for your mana base is the modal double-faced lands that have a spell on one side and a land on the other. These lands, such as Agadim's Awakening, Valakut Awakening, and Ondu Inversion, are excellent ways to beef up your mana base while providing some insurance against potential mana flood. Other notable utility lands include Strip Mine, Cabal Coffers, Reliquary Tower, Urborg, and Yavimaya, and the castles from the original Eldraine set. There are, of course, many more utility lands that you should consider for your deck. There are so many in fact, that there are no longer as many auto-include utility lands in the Commander format. There are still a few though. Black decks should auto-include Takanuma, Bojuka Bog, and Castle Lochthwain. Blue decks should auto-include Atawara and Mystic Sanctuary. Green decks should auto-include Bosaiju and Turn Timber Symbiosis. White decks should auto-include Iganjo and Ondu Inversion, while red decks should auto-include Valakut Awakening and Spikefield Hazard. Any decks that have a high curve should auto-include Ancient Tomb. Decks that draw a ton of cards, and only decks that draw a ton of cards, should auto-include Reliquary Tower. A common deck-building mistake among new players is automatically adding a Reliquary Tower to a deck that never ever ends a turn with more than 7 cards in hand. Utility lands are at their best in mono and 2-color decks. These decks don't generally struggle with casting their spells, and so have plenty of room to run as many as 8 utility lands. The more colors in your deck, the fewer utility lands you'll have room for. As the downside for playing a colorless or even monocolor land gets exponentially higher, the more colors you need to fix for. I would recommend playing 8 utility lands in monocolor and 2-color decks, 5 utility lands in 3-color decks, and 4 utility lands in a 4 or 5-color deck. Mana acceleration. Conventional wisdom once suggested that mana rocks are the bedrock of a commander mana base. This has become less true the more time has gone on. As low mana value spells get better and better, there becomes less and less need to ramp into big spells early. That's not to say that you shouldn't play any mana ramp, but rather that you should be more selective with the mana rocks you do play. Most green decks will still benefit greatly from rampant growth effects or mana dorks, while some expensive non-green commanders still want to hit the field ahead of schedule. So if your deck does want mana acceleration, what kinds of acceleration should you play? Mana rocks that cost 3 mana are too slow for the current commander metagame. Even mana rocks that cost 2 aren't as ubiquitous as they once were. Arcane Signet is the premier 2-mana rock in the format. Thank you very much, Paper Brawl. The next best mana rock cycle, the Talismans, are now available to enemy color pairs thanks to Modern Horizons. Wow, I never thought I'd say the words thanks and Modern Horizons in the same sentence, but here we are. Below the Talismans are the Signets and the 2 best colorless mana rocks, Mind Stone and Thought Vessel. Don't worry, Sol Ring is still always worth running in your deck. If they're in your budget, a bevy of other strong 1 and 0 mana accelerants exist, such as Mana Vault, Mana Crypt, Jeweled Lotus, and a variety of Moxen. Assuming your deck does want mana rocks, I would recommend playing 5 mana rocks. For a 2-color deck that isn't looking to include Mana Vault or Crypt, these mana rocks should be Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, the Talisman for your color pair, the Ravnica Ravnica Signet for your color pair, a Thought Vessel if your deck plays Reliquary Tower, or a Mind Stone if it does not. For 3 color decks that don't play green, your mana rocks should be Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, and the 3 talismans in your colors. Multicolor green decks should play at minimum the following mana acceleration: Sol Ring, Birds of Paradise, Delighted Halfling, Farseek, Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, Rampant Growth, and Arcane Signet. Building the mana base. Now that you have an understanding of the best mana sources in Commander, it's time to put together your deck's mana base. All told, your optimized monocolor Commander deck should have the following breakdown: 25 to 30 basic lands, 8 to 10 utility lands, and 3 to 6 mana rocks. 2-color Commander decks should have the following mana base: 1 command tower, 8 fetch lands, 1 OG dual land, 1 shock land, 1 battle bond land, 1 slow land, 1 pain land, 1 check land, 1 pathway, 1 filter land, 1 horizon land or tango land, 1 Ravnica bounce land, 10 to 14 basic lands, 6 to 8 utility lands, and 5 mana rocks. 3-color mana bases should be composed of 3 to 4 untapped rainbow lands, 1 triome, 10 fetch lands, meaning the 9 on-color dual fetches, and 1 prismatic vista, 3 of the OG dual lands, or 3 pain lands if you can't afford them, 3 shock lands, 3 battle bond lands, 3 slow lands, 1 to 2 horizon lands, 7 to 10 basic lands, 4 to 6 utility lands, and 5 mana rocks. 4 and 5-color mana bases should play 5 untapped rainbow lands, all 11 fetch lands, 3 triomes, 6 or 10 OG dual lands, 3 to 6 shock lands, 2 to 3 bond lands, 1 to 3 horizon lands, 5 to 7 basic lands, 2 to 4 utility lands, a Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, and 6 or more green mana accelerants. Please feel free to time code these pages and use as references when building your Commander deck. Now remember, this video was meant to be a helpful guide for players who find the process of building a mana base daunting. The guidelines laid out are not a one-size-fits-all. Every commander has its own mana requirements, from total land count to number of utility lands to how much acceleration your deck should play. This is indeed Tolarian Community College's definitive mana base guide for Commander, but in the end, it is still that, a guide. Don't take the ratios laid out in this video as a set of hard rules. Rather, use them as a jumping off point from which to tune your specific deck's mana base. And in that sense, I hope very much this video has been of some help to you. If you want to see some Commander mana bases in action, don't forget to check out our gameplay show, Shuffle Up and Play. We've recently had a series of some awesome Commander games, and I hope very much that you will enjoy watching them. I will link to them as well as to the complete Season 2 playlist in this video's description, or just click up on the thing. It's appearing up on there somewhere. Yes. And remember, you are gorgeous and sexy whether you are bald, balding, have long hair, or short. It is you that is attractive, and you just get to decide how you wish to present yourself to the world. But what happens if the way you wish to present yourself is not what Mother Nature had in mind? Well, that's where Keeps comes in. Keeps is just a tool that you can use to take control of how you wish to present yourself to that world. So remember, hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get started, go to keeps.com/Tolarian, or just click the link in this video's description. That's keeps.com/Tolarian. Thank you, Keeps, for sponsoring this video.
Next time on Shuffle Up and Play, kisses and hugs.
Today, Aaron Hansen picks the format. What did you choose for us today, Aaron?
Under $50? This is Ogdus the Dragon's Lash.
Hi, I'm Spencer Crittenden, Akeem the Soaring Wind.
My commander is Volrath the Fallen.
Hi there, I am Talia Vez, Yargle, and Multani.
Ah!
What?
Yargle! What do you live in a glen?
No, well, maybe.
Kind of.
This is a hard decision.
I don't think it is, just hit me.
Yeah, you're right. It's not a hard decision.
What? You haven't seen the
station agent?
He has a hat.
Oh, he doesn't have a hat.
Does anyone want to cut me?
Absolutely.
Not that way. But after the show, we can talk.